Hey everyone, this is Zan here. This is the first episode in a series Chris and I are doing where we read short essays and discuss them on the podcast. If you would like to follow along, you can look in the description of this episode and there'll be a link to the essay. This week we're doing Against Interpretation by Susan Sontag, a very short essay, so yeah, feel free to read along if you would like.
I'm Christopher C. York, instructor of philosophy at Langara College.
And I'm Zan Plesner. I'm a student at Langara College.
And this is
Synthesis and Sophistry.
All right, today we are discussing, at Zan's urging, Susan Sontag's classic article, Against Interpretation. Zan, can you tell me a little bit why you wanted to discuss this particular article this week?
Yeah, I really like Susan Sontag as an essayist. I find she's a really good writer, picks interesting topics and comes at them from an interesting perspective. And on our mysticism episode, when we were talking kind of about language and how it silos certain experiences, it immediately made me think of this. And yeah, something I wanted to talk about.
Well, since this is our first in our series of synthesis and sophistry focuses on pieces, I guess we should go about this in an analytic way. So the first thing we have to do when we're analyzing an article is to find the main thesis, and I think it's right there in the title, isn't it? Sontag just puts her cards on the table and says, look, I'm against interpretation. So that mystery is solved. Maybe the more interesting question is, how does she support this thesis, or what are the steps that she takes en route to arriving at this thesis?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think she lays out the history of art theory, because she's mainly focusing on art here, but I think you can extrapolate the ideas further. So she looks at what she calls the earliest theory of art, which was the ancient Greek philosophers. You had Plato, who thought that art was just an imitation of an imitation. He was concerned about the world of forms and how our world is just imperfect copies of perfect ideas of things. So you had him, and then you had Aristotle, who thought that art serve the emotions. So she says through this, art had to justify itself. It couldn't just be in the world. It had to be for something or have some other aspect to it. That's how I read.
Right. Yeah. No. That's the starting off point, right? The discussion of mimesis and catharsis, right? Catharsis is the idea that art and drama and other kinds of expression help us to give vent to desires and feelings that we wouldn't ordinarily have the opportunity to productively engage with in ordinary life. However, right, once you say that, because of the ideas of mimesis and catharsis, art has to then defend itself and justify itself, isn't that the case for any cultural product or institution? I mean, the justice system has to defend its existence. The way that we use language has to defend its current practices. And why should art be any different, right? Why should art be excluded from the category of cultural products and institutions that we have to construct a defense for or a justification for? Why is it special in Sontag's view?
Yeah, I think at least how I read it, how I interpret her article. It's because it's so directly tied to our experience of things. I think it's a institution that plays off our experience. And I think her main sort of idea here is that in trying to understand these experiences through certain lenses, we're distancing ourselves from these experiences. And I guess the justice system or things along those lines aren't so concerned with our subjective experiences.
Okay, so if I understand you and Sontag more or less, I think that we're making a meta critique, right? Or a critique about a critique, or a critique about the practice of critiquing. And what we're saying here is that I think there's a sociological claim that Sontag's making, is that in this society right now, there's too much over-intellectualization in the art critic world. And I'd like it to stop. Thank you very much. What would I replace it with? Well, here it seems to be more of like an aesthetic preference that she's expressing. Like, I'd enjoy art more, and I enjoy art criticism more if it were more phenomenologically immediate, engaging, and less critical overall. And I can relate with that somewhat. Having been to various, let's say, art gallery openings, and over canapes, just hearing someone spout wankery about the things hanging on the walls or the things being performed in the gallery. I get that impulse. I do. But I can't help but think that this meta critique is itself suspect. By which I mean it's slightly disingenuous, because I feel like Sontag is the kind of person that, if there were an unintellectually defendable art form, she would be the first to attack it, probably, right? I mean, she has the equipment, right? She's using the intellect to destroy the intellectual practice of art critical activity. So she's in that camp. Now, that doesn't mean that she is somehow availing herself of tools that she shouldn't be using. Of course, it's understandable that if you're an intellectual, you use your intellect to critique over-intellectualization. That's perfectly fine. But is she just being, contrarian here, right? In other words, is she just arguing the point for the sake of arguing the point?
Yeah, I think she's pointing to something a little bit more valuable. I do agree with your critique. I do think that
my critique of her critique of critiquing.
Yes. Yeah, I don't think we can. I don't know what it would look like to stop interpreting art, and I think part of what makes art great is discussing it with other people and finding new ways to look at it. I'm a fan of hermeneutics. She is not, but I do think, she points at something interesting where what I take it to be is, I've had this happen where I'm watching a movie or something and I'm looking at it and I'm trying to figure it out the whole time, and it takes away from it takes me away from the experience or out of myself. Yeah, I think you've brought up this example before with the whiskey connoisseur. Sometimes we can have, if we're new to drinking whiskey, we'll have an expert there to say, oh, have you noticed these hints of vanilla or all that? And once that's suggested, that's the lens that you're understanding that experience through. And I think for me, what this article does is scrutinize that a little bit, even if I don't think you should take this to its logical conclusion where we just stop interpreting things.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a bit, it's polemical in places, right? When she says, for example, on page 98 that, interpretation is the revenge of the intellect upon the world. To interpret is to impoverish, to deplete the world in order to set up a shadow world of meanings, as he has turned the world into this world, as if there were any other. So this, I think, it's not a real criticism. It's a polemic, and And like you say, I think you can see that when you look at the world and you say, well, how could we not engage in art interpretation? How do you just live in the given? What some people call the content, but what she protests, right? So she says that that the split between form and content is artificial and misleading, right? But she herself, I mean, benefits from the use of these terms to help understand the subject that she's addressing, which is, art criticism. So to not avail ourselves of these tools seems to be to put a fence around the intellectualization of the art and to sort of bring it into something that we also talked about, which is the mystical, right? And say, look, just don't talk about this. It's something that you just feel it, man. Art is something that you feel, and art should feel good. It shouldn't be over-intellectualized. It shouldn't be desiccated. It shouldn't be lifeless. It shouldn't be a bummer, in other words. So this leads her to her conclusion, right, is that in the place of a hermeneutics, we need an erotics of art. Now, this is its own section, and it's the concluding section. And I think that if we're going to, look at her piece critically, we need to understand what is happening in this addendum or in this concluding section. I think that something, if I could put forward an idea.
Go for it, yeah.
I think that there's some sort of appeal to sex or sexiness or sexuality going on here. There's a fallacy afoot, my friend. So let's say that you're Susan Sontag in your mid-30s, and you conclude your article with this sassy little, in the place of hermeneutics, we need an erotics of art. And you and I were like, oh yeah, you're right. My God, we do need an erotics of art. But now imagine, I don't know, myself or Alex Boston or Richard Johns ending our essays with such an appeal. I'm going to say that's probably less convincing to you, right? And if I insist, Susanna, we need an erotics of art. It's hard. It's a harder sell. So I'm going to say that claim at least is sort of agent relative. It is of a time and of a place and of a person who uttered that. And without that context, it is completely unconvincing.
So if I'm hearing you right, you're accusing me of thinking with my dick.
No, I'm accusing everybody who's reading this and not being critical of it as thinking, well, not thinking enough.
Yeah. Okay, yeah.
Because, I don't think that it's there in lieu of argumentation, right? It's a claim, and it's a claim that rests on an evident kind of horniness for a certain kind of aesthetic, content. Let's put it that way. So let's read a little bit more in the previous section. See how she gets there. Right. She says that what is important is to recover our senses. We must learn to see more, hear more, to feel more. The aim of all commentary on art should now be to make works of art and, by analogy, our own experience more rather than less real to us. The function of criticism should be show us how it is what it is. Let me repeat that because this is a tough sentence. The function of criticism should be to show how it is what it is, even that it is what it is, rather than to show what it means. So I'm thinking here about, let's say, your classical landscape painting, right? To fit with Sontag's art commentary instead of art criticism, I suppose, we should look at brushstrokes. We should look at, shapes and lines, but we shouldn't try to impose an interpretation, because that is to overlay the content with new content, right? And that's what that's really what she's objecting to, I think, is a sort of something that she regards as an intellectual vice or intellectual dishonesty, of the type when you start to, for instance, apologize for the sexy parts of the Bible or the raucous behavior of the Greek gods, right? So you add another layer of interpretation over the ancient texts in order to sort of sanitize it for modern consumption. And say, well, Zeus really didn't become a swan and rape somebody. That's an analogy that represents, the overcoming of whatever, this with that. And she talks a little bit about the Song of Songs or the Song of Solomon in the Bible, and how you sort of try to show that this is not about eroticism. It's actually just it's a metaphor about love and respect, or something like that. So you apologize for parts of the text that are embarrassing after the fact by over-explaining them, overwriting them, and that's kind of dishonest.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, one problem I have with this is I do think when it comes to things like the Bible, maybe, the fact that everyone can interpret it in a different way is a problem. But I think that that's a feature of art where that's an area in our life that it's healthy to indulge those sort of acts of interpreting things, where when it comes to laws or science, you want to be more direct and have the right interpretation. But there's still that desire within us to interpret things. And I think art is the place that we should exercise that. So,
yeah, I mean, but there's an issue, I guess, that's inherent here, which I think maybe Sontag is calling out, which is that if every interpretation is as valid as any other interpretation, then really we can say anything about anything and it sticks. It has equal weight or validity. And so then the practice of criticism really does collapse in on itself if that's how we look at it, right? If we say that, well, that's just your interpretation, man, go with it. Doesn't there have to be some set of criteria which we say, well, actually that's a bad analogy or that's a bad metaphor that doesn't work in this circumstance. This other one that I'm offering works better or is more apt or is better supported by the relevant features of the content.
For me, the way that I think about this, because I'm someone who likes wackier interpretations of things, but like you said, in our philosophy and literature class a few times, show me where it says that in the text. So long as you can make an argument how this is supported by the text, I'm pretty willing to stretch things pretty far. But I've always found it dismissive when people say, "Oh, the blue door is just a blue door," or maybe the blue door is a metaphor for someone being depressed. Which one of those is more interesting? And if you can ground it in the text and it makes sense within that world, I go for the second interpretation because it's more fruitful and it makes it more meaningful. I think I'm in disagreement with Sontag, but I bring it up because it was something that I disagreed with and I still found interesting and value in.
Yeah, it's a great essay, and it's brief enough, I think, that it suits our purposes in that, if you want to listen to the podcast, follow along, you have 10 pages of reading to do, and you're there. And even though Sontag's discussion is peppered with various art historical and literary references, it's not above most people's heads. I don't think that's not where she's aiming. I think that she makes her point fairly directly, and I think a lot of people can find some affinity with this, let's say, desire that she has to topple or reduce the role of the intellect in the artistic world. So she does talk about some aesthetic categories which somehow escape critical interpretation. So this is section 7 on page 101. She talks about abstract and pop art and I think indirectly here, Dadaist poetry. And she says that these categories of art resist interpretation because in the case of abstract art, it's nothing. It doesn't show anything in particular, so it can't be interpreted as being anything in particular. Now, then the question is it decorative? It's simply decorative at this point, right? Just the geometric forms or whatever. Are they just, or are they non-art, or they have no artistic message at all that can be discerned? And like Dadaist poetry, right? For example, or when she goes pop art in here, if you're just drawing random words from a hat, like the Dadaists used to do, right? The fun thing about that is that the mind tries to put meaning into randomly drawn phrases. I suppose just like if you had a blender. Actually, this is a project I did with a friend of mine, Gordon Eisner. We made an app that took all the words from Moby Dick and rearranged them. Right, and so whenever you pressed a button, it would take the full contents of Moby Dick and it would present it in a different order. So you had a very different book each time, but it was the same contents. It's like putting a piece of literature through an atomizer. And you would, as you read through the garbled book, your mind would try to make sense of some passages. A seeming narrative would apparently present itself to your mind, even though you knew that it was never intentional, right? These words were never meant to be put together in this order by a human author. Still, we have this urge to find meaning in random shapes and compositions. I think this is called pareidolia.
Pareidolia?
Yeah. So this is how, for example, we talked a little bit, I think, about the works of Salvador Dali and how he would stare at rocks until he saw faces, and then he would paint the faces, and different kinds of shapes would manifest themselves. So it's where, like, there is no inherent picture in something, but the human mind, for example, will see like a smile in a donut or whatever, right? So to go back to that, with the Dadaist poetry, for instance, you can't really say that there is an artist's intention that needs to be interpreted a certain way, this or that, or that there's a right way to draw random words out of a hat, or a right way to stare at a rock until you see a face. None of that really admits of interpretation. So maybe, right, here's a category of aesthetic products that eludes the overriding efforts of the critics. But then again, Sontag says, even though these categories exist, as long as we have to resort to using them, art is on the run, which is an interesting claim. She doesn't want art to be on the run. She wants art to stand proud and sort of bristling with animal energy by the sounds of it, right?
Yeah, I was confused about that. If art isn't something that moves, do we want it to be a static thing? Because she talked about how once we moved away from a more religious view of the world or enchanted view of the world, how interpretation was summoned to reconcile the ancient texts to modern demands. And she talks about the Homer's epics through that lens, and almost is saying that it's disrespecting the original art by trying to change it to whatever social lens we want to put it through. Right. And I find that really odd. I think that part of what constitutes something being a work of art is audience and interpretation. So to have it completely on its own, or like, how do you respect a work of art?
Right. I think that's what she discusses in section 5, right? When she says that interpretation makes art manageable and comfortable, and real art should make us nervous, right? So she, in this context, she talks about the character of Stanley Kowalski in A Streetcar Named Desire, and says, "Look, this is just a guy, shouting on and assaulting this woman, and we have to." She thinks that it's maybe weak or disingenuous to try to make this more palatable and pretty by forcing an interpretation on it. Just say, no, these are just human animals doing random things. Watch this on stage for a couple of hours and then, enjoy the artistic grandeur and just leave. Don't try to figure it out. But I think that does some violence to the kind of creatures that we are. I think if we didn't reflect on these scenes in the theater, what would be the point? Here's just some stuff happening. And of course, I think here's my counter Sontag claim. I would say, if that's the kind of art that you're interested in, it's the job of the art itself to grab me by the collars and shake me out of my over-intellectualizing complacency and have that moment of, the Kantian sublime or whatever, where I'm overcome with the power of the work, and I lose myself in it. And at that point, I think we've arrived at some sort of evidence of aesthetic value. But I think that Sontag's got it the wrong way around. She's asking you to leave your brains at home when you go to the theater. But I think it's the job of the theater to shock us out of our brains, right? At least temporarily. And, we leave the theater, there's an exciting moment. We go, what happened there? And I think that's an interesting discussion to have. Like, that was powerful. Why was it so powerful? And, I think that would be my position, I suppose.
Yeah, this brings to mind why do we not just only watch pornography? Because
this is a question you ask yourself often,
every day. No, but if it's truly just erotics, we should leave interpretation behind. The form is the only thing, or what matters then, and not the content. Well, there's really not much content within pornography, right? But it gives us that very visceral sensation.
Sure.
So
you don't need to get more specific.
Would you like me to?
No, it's fine.
Okay.
So, yeah. But yeah, I think I see this is your reductio ad absurdum of Sontag's position.
Yeah.
And so if just feeling is so important, then why don't I just watch, content that really makes me feel effectively, and quickly? Why mess around, right? with a narrative framing or a story? Get me right into the good stuff. Make me feel something. So I think that's a fair reductio, and I think that maybe her position is vulnerable to something like this, right? And to say that there's too much of an embrace of the so-called erotics of art at the expense of a lot of other kinds of qualities. But I think too, like, the reason that I take issue with this closing sentence, right, in place of hermeneutics, we need an erotics of art. I think that's putting too fine a point on it. I think up until that point, she's simply emphasizing sensuality of aesthetic experience, not necessarily erotic as a subcategory of the sensual, right? Like if you're eating a watermelon, it's sensual, but it's not erotic, right?
Yeah.
It's engaging. It's aesthetically engaging, but it's not like, for most people anyway, it's not an erotic act to eat a watermelon. But I think that, she has a more defensible position before that point, before she narrows it to the band of the erotic. I think, again, that just shows me that it's more polemic than, a carefully reasoned position, right?
I think she's adding a bit of flavor.
Exactly. Yeah. We're talking about it, right? Which means that it's working.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think that we also have to say that this doesn't make as much sense as her previous claim that the artistic product or the artistic act should be one that addresses the senses, which I think nobody would really disagree with, except for the people who are into conceptual art and say, well, that actually there's a genre of art, right, where the intellect is key to unlocking the aesthetic value.
Like David Lynch movies?
No, I mean like, so art where the it's the idea that's being presented that's important more than what is shown.
Yeah.
So for some, genres of art, like sculpture, you need a statue, right? You need a painting in painting. And so you have the product, right? Which is usually in classical art, it's sort of held up as the thing that it has value, right? The thing you can engage with, has aesthetic qualities, and based on those, you can rank it and rate it and value it. But let's say, for example, that my conceptual art is I just sit in the art gallery and I read from the phone book, right? That's conceptual art, right? There's an aesthetic dimension to it, but that's not primarily what's at play here, right? You have to kind of figure out what the joke is, or what the piece is saying, right? And without that, there isn't much remarkable going on aesthetically.
Yeah.
So it's what is happening in the mind of the artist or the mind of the viewer.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Okay. Yeah, I guess what I like about this article, and we've already touched upon it, but is that part where she's talking about how we try to be above or separate ourselves from the experience of art. Like she talks about Kafka in here, and I was thinking about my experience of reading The Castle by Kafka, which I did not finish because the whole experience was one of boredom and frustration with the book. I really like it now, but it was hard to pick up and hard to continue reading the whole time I was. And I was feeling this, and then I went on YouTube and typed in analysis, and it gave me all these tools to understand it. And now, for me, I no longer had to wrestle with those emotions that this brought up. I could kind of I get it now. And I think sometimes when I watch like a David Lynch movie or a movie where what the hell was that? For a long time, I've just, gone on YouTube or typed in analysis and seen what other people have said. And it helps me not have to, it's like, okay, I get that now. I can move on. And I've tried to make a habit of not doing that right away now and try and sit with it a bit.
In a way, it's like looking up the answers to the crossword puzzle before you do the crossword.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like, they've done this analysis for me, so
yeah.
I think I'm with the anti-intellectuals to a point here. I think that having ideally having an uninfluenced experience with the thing itself allows you to maybe feel or think something special, unique about it. That's yours, as opposed to being filtered through a Wikipedia page before you get to it. And then you're like, okay, well, this is the standard reception. I don't want to be controversial, so I'm just going to adopt the standard reception to this particular piece. I do think that is like, solving the crossword puzzle before you look at the clues. And then you write in all the letters because you see you have the crossword key, and then you look at what the clues were. There's less enjoyment there, I would think.
Maybe I'm just attacking your metaphor here, but I don't think art isn't something to be solved, though, right?
Well, that's the thing, right? According to the the interpretation model that she's attacking, that seems to be kind of what that's the parody of criticism that she's attacking.
She is saying that it's something to be solved.
But I think that you and I agree that this is kind of a straw man argument against art criticism.
Yeah.
I think, and too, like, I mean, to say that, content is, useless, made up category, I think that that's to deny that the word is pretty useful, right? Like, so what's the content of this painting? Well, it's 3 circles, isn't it? Right? And you can try to figure out what those circles are. I'm referring to a piece of art in my office, which I guess that you could photograph and display if you want. It's a piece by my ex-wife, which is I take it as mostly decorative. I've never actually sat around trying to figure out precisely what it means. I don't think it means anything. I probably appreciate it in the way that Sontag thinks I should. It just exists as an object in my office. I don't worry my head about I'm not haunted by the need to impose an interpretation on it. I think it's just blobs of paint, isn't it?
I mean, this gets to something that I was a little bit interested in. I'm not sure. It's kind of just floating around in my head, but in order for Sontag to, be against interpretation, does she have to kind of take a Platonic view of art in which art has a meaning and is art regardless of audience, or because like I said before, when I think about art, part of what constitute art is the interpretation and an audience, where if I'm thinking this through correctly, Plato, because of how he thinks about the forms of things, maybe I think to counter that, there's an idea that art is a thing in itself, and rather than.
I don't think she's committed to a Platonic idea of what art is. I think that maybe she's more. She's trying to say that art is something that of necessity engages with us sensually, on a sensual basis, right? So let's go back to the whiskey tasting. Okay. Maybe it's a bad analogy for this kind of thing, but I think it tells the story. Sontag wants you to go to the bar and order the whiskey and just drink the whiskey. And afterwards, you can sort out how you feel about it. The wrong way to drink whiskey would be go to a whiskey tasting course in advance and be told about what the whiskeys are and how you should be tasting them. So that would get in the way of the experience for Sontag. I think it would over-theorize, over-complicate it. Just put the whiskey in my mouth and I'll figure it out for myself, right? And that's, that's maybe it's a parody of her position, but at the same time, it kind of gets to the heart of it, I think. She wants people to go to the gallery and just be confronted and blown away by aesthetic magnificence of all sorts.
Yeah, and I think, again, this is the part that I appreciate about it. Again, with science or justice or something along those lines, this relates back to our mysticism episode. You want to be able to communicate properly with these sort of things, but I think it's important to carve out areas in our lives where we're intentionally just trying to experience things or not put values on everything immediately. And that's what I take away from this.
Right. And let's call that the normative thesis here, right? Is that, you are better off if you don't over-intellectualize art, right? It's better if you don't for yourself and everybody else around you. To this, I would say, right, if you really hold to Sontag's position, you can refuse to read art criticism. You can refuse to talk to art critics. There are ways around this. You don't have to just shut down the fun of the art critics. They can be doing their thing while you're doing your thing. And I think a disciplined artist, or one that thinks that they're going to be thrown off by a kind of angle of criticism that isn't fair to their work, they can choose not to read the reviews, right? They can isolate themselves from that information, presumably, and keep making the kind of emotionally, viscerally powerful art that Sontag praises here. That's unintellectual or anti-intellectual even. No problem with that. And I think again, right? What's happening here is not so much that she's got a manifesto against interpretation, so to speak. She's at the end of the day expressed her preference for a kind of art that's unmediated by theory.
Yeah.
Which is fine. Mm-hmm. she can have that opinion.
Yeah.
She can have that taste, but I don't I think that what tells against her argument is that we have a deeply seated need to interpret. Mm-hmm. The world is ripe with actual and potential meanings, and our minds are just naturally cued to do that kind of detective work. Mm-hmm. We can't help ourselves. Mm-hmm. We're curious beings, we're sensitive beings, and we're going to try to make connections between various objects in the world. And to ask us not to do that is to ask us to engage in a kind of mental or psychological contortionism, which we're not easily capable of.
Yeah, I like that last point, the contortionism. I would have to try hard to not interpret, and I don't know what that would look like.
We'd have to be a different kind of animal, I think. We'd have to be like a non-reflective, non-critical animal.
Yeah, and a huge part of the value of art, I find, is, like, I think about my favorite albums or movies. Knowing more about how the sausage is made adds to the experience a lot of the time. Like, oh, they used this weird setup to get this sort of sound. When I listen back to it, that enhances the experience in so many ways by knowing more and interpreting more about it.
I think it certainly can, right? It can, instead of overwriting or cheapening the experience like Sontag says it does, it can actually enhance and enrich if you're of a certain bent, or if you've encountered the art so many times that you've gotten all you can from it phenomenologically. Mm-hmm. And then maybe it's okay to start laying on some interpretation or some background information. And that might actually make it pop for you in a way that it had stopped popping. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So what's your verdict then? What's your final verdict on against interpretation? Are you convinced? Are you wooed by Sontag's argumentation here, or are you?
I'm not convinced, but I like I said, I think there's something valuable here, and for me, like I said, it's because so much of our lives is trying to make sense of the world. There's something valuable about stepping back and just trying to be open to the experience that comes to you. And that's really for me what this article does for me. Even if it does, you can pretty quickly find some logical holes in it.
Yeah, I think it's an important contribution. I think, I'm going to say about against interpretation what I'd say about a lot of works that are extreme and memorable but not very careful, which is that it's better to be interestingly wrong than uninterestingly right. Mm-hmm. So she's really put the pedal to the floor here against art critics. And by doing so, she shines an important light on, let's say, a certain unwelcome and obtrusive influence that art critics can have on, creatives of all types. So that spotlight needs to be shone. It has been shone. Thank you very much. But I'm not persuaded that I have to abandon all of my rational and critical faculties when I enter into an environment where I'm likely to engage with art. Quite the contrary, I think that's putting the stress in the wrong place. It's the job of the artist. If they want me to be transported, out of my rational mind, they've got to put the work in. They have to convince me to abandon my rational intellectual armor that I carry with me through this world, quite rightly. And I have been successfully wowed by aesthetic experiences.
Transformers 2?
What a mess those movies are. I just feel sick. All those whirring gears and just, like, who wanted that? Who said this was
Studio execs.
The world needs more of this.
Yeah.
For me, what made Transformers interesting, maybe as a toy, is the fact that there are so few moving parts that you need to make a convincing transformation of form. But when you look at like the Michael Bay Transformer movies, and there's a million moving parts, and there's like in a Transformer's mouth, there's like a thousand things you can look at that are pulling in different directions. It's all just makes you feel nauseous and disoriented.
I don't think Michael Bay knows less is more. I think he rejects that.
More is more.
Yeah, more is more. Always.
Except when it's not. And that would be, I guess, Transformers 2 and maybe Transformers 1 and maybe all the Transformers movies that I've been exposed to. Like you copped to walking out on Kafka. I will cop to walking out on Michael Bay's. I think whenever it's playing, I just leave the room. If you don't want me around, this is your visual cue. Just start putting Transformers on. I'll be gone. I'll be gone.
Yeah. Well, I guess we all have our intellectual vices. For me, it's Kafka. For you, it's Transformers.
Yeah, it's a weak spot.
Yeah.
It tilts me.
Okay, Chris. Well, thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll see you next week for more of our Focus On series.
Yeah, sounds good.